gonna skip the discussion. We're gonna immediately go into questions. So any questions that you have about any of these topics, I certainly welcome you to write them down, legible, please. The lost art form of handwriting. I really appreciate your guys' engagement, and I really appreciate that you guys have, during the discussion, have really opened up to one another. I think in these small little ways that may seem insignificant to others, just talking about these things in a very personal way and then hearing other people talk in their own personal experiences can be very rewarding, and it's just another unique way we break the stigma, we normalize these challenges and issues that everybody is dealing with, even if we don't always talk about it or if we don't always listen either. So we talked about anxiety, right? And we're looking at how that's normal, but oftentimes the way we shape our lives and the messages we get through society, we really have amped up that we're living in this period of anxiety, and we're seeing all these ways that it's affecting us. And then we set that up so that then we could talk about technology. And again, people, similar to what I mentioned earlier with parenting, like people's philosophy and people's use with technology, I don't ever want to take that right away. It's just try to, again, broaden our understanding, understand our why. It's especially important for us adults and older folks, because think about how much of your life when it comes to young people, part of our reference point was like, well, we did this when I was young and I turned out fine. We don't have that reference point with technology and smartphones, so the immediate response for a lot of people is like, it's dangerous. And it's not to say, again, using the fire illustration, it's not that there aren't dangers, but so much of our understanding of risk is our own experiences. And if we came out with it all right, it's like that oftentimes is reassuring to us. And if we don't have that with technology and social media, we can't say, we don't know what it was like to be a teenager and have a smartphone. We don't know what it's like, so it's oftentimes difficult to understand even what it's like for our young people. But now we want to shift to talking really about this idea of resiliency. You know, how to develop a resilient mindset. And at its most basic form, let's just define it so we kind of understand what we're talking about. It's the ability to bounce back from adversity and setbacks stronger and wiser. Now, I'm going to give you a very real example in my own life. So when I was in the 7th grade, all of my friends were on the AAU basketball team. Now, if you take a look at me, you might say, from a physical standpoint, I don't really look like AAU material. But I loved basketball. I was a good defender. I was just a natural athlete. And I worked really, really hard with these really small, tiny hands to try to shoot with some level of consistency. Really worked on my physical conditioning and stamina. I'd played travel soccer, which was very natural to me. Whereas basketball, I just had a lot more limitations, and I practiced and I practiced and I practiced, and I tried out for the AAU team with all my best friends, and I didn't make it. And I was devastated. But I was determined. I'm like, I'm gonna make it next year. I'm gonna practice even harder. And so that year for Christmas, I asked for a basketball basket and backboard. We put it up above our garage, and I would practice my dribbling, practice my shot. It was getting better, not great. And but soccer and other things were always keeping me in shape. I'd go play with my friends who were on AAU, and I'd say, like, I can kind of hang. Like, yeah, we know who's the most talented and the least talented, but it's not like I'm a scrub. And I practiced and I practiced and I practiced. And the following year, there's AAU tryouts, and guess what? No, I didn't make it. No. I was the last one cut. And I tell that story because resiliency doesn't guarantee you the outcome. But that ability for me, that first disappointment to say I'm going to try harder, and then the second time, even when I didn't get it, and I cried right in front of the coach who was my best friend's dad. I cried. But by then, after sad and devastated, I moved on. And I still played school ball for a couple years, and then I eventually retired my junior year because I always like to joke, I didn't outgrow basketball. Basketball outgrew me. But there's something about that ability to handle setbacks and disappointment, to discover some degree of self-determination out of that. The easiest thing would have been for me to not try out again. Fear of disappointment, fear of the pain, rejection, whatever that may be. And we talk about resiliency a lot, especially when we're talking about anxiety, because anxiety's one of its most detrimental impact on us is avoidance. We're afraid to fail, afraid to be embarrassed, afraid to be rejected. So what do? We stop trying, or we avoid things that in a very real or even in a perceived notion could lead to negative experiences. And what we know about anxiety is that the more you avoid something, you actually are fueling that fear. It gets bigger, it gets harder. Putting it off doesn't make it easier. It actually just makes the anxiety and the fear worse. We know how the brain works. We know when it comes to phobias, the treatment is progressive, prolonged exposure therapy. What is that? Well, you lean into the discomfort, but in small, measurable steps, because exposure leads to desensitization. That's how the brain works. The brain is adaptable. That's why people that misuse drugs and alcohol build tolerance. The brain builds up desensitization. And that's why resilience is so critical in how not just to live a healthy life, but how to battle and combat anxiety. Because we really are coming out of a period of time where it was very well-intentioned, but there was too many messages in our society about this is uncomfortable, you don't like this, then avoid it. Don't deal with it. Safe spaces, trigger warnings. Those things have their place, but very for a small population, but it got normalized to everything. Discomfort, right? But what that's basically saying is anything that makes us uncomfortable and we experience an unsettling emotion, like we shouldn't deal with it. All we're doing is setting ourselves up to being that much more uncomfortable and sensitized, hypersensitized to negative emotions. And just like we talked about with anxiety, you can't avoid anxiety. You can't be happy all the time. So how do we then live a meaningful life in the midst and throes of anxiety or intense emotions? It's through resiliency. Because we have to develop through not just learning, but experiences. And experiences require us to be out in the world, to live, to experience. No matter what age you are, everyone in this room, you realize you have not discovered everything that you're good at. Despite your age, you realize you haven't discovered everything that you like. And despite your age, no one in this room has discovered all the things that I call the sweet spot in life. The sweet spot, those things that we're good at and we like. Because oftentimes over our lives, we shrink to what's familiar and what is comfortable. And our society and our family units have really lost a lot of that resiliency. Through experience and learning. Now, here's the biggest thing that most parents agree with me on a philosophical level, but on an emotional and a parenting level, they don't like this message. We need to let kids make mistakes and poor choices. Because the fear of failure comes from this hyper need to be perfect. And when we make every little mistake, like that could ruin your life, you're risking college, you're risking this or that, you're sending this message that we have to be hyper vigilant, always on. Right? We talked about anxiety. Our brains need to be able to come to a state of rest and recovery. But if you're always on and everything is the most important thing and every assignment could be the reason you do or don't get into college, then a couple things happen. Number one is we lose all perspective because everything is the most important thing and everything has dire consequences. But the other is we're conditioning our bodies to be tense, hyper-aroused. And that's oftentimes why we can do something like overuse technology, because we need this quick thing to just kind of help that tension and that escapism, rather than how do we help our body work through the ebbs and flows of responsibility and challenges in life. We need to be able to make mistakes because, believe it or not, 1/3 of our life experiences are through disappointment and mistakes. I'm not talking hard science percentage, but we learn and grow through our successes. We learn and grow through our mistakes, setbacks, and disappointment. And then we learn 1/3 of the time through leaps of faith. We don't know, but let's go find out what this is like. Without resiliency, people only live and learn through their successes. And if it's not guaranteed, if we can't guarantee or predict it, then we won't even try, right? Avoidance. And then we really shrink our lives. So let's talk about what a resilient mindset is. And I'm operating from research that talks about resiliency, but I'm also bringing this about by what oftentimes we call protective or pro-social factors. What that oftentimes is, there have been various times where a school has contacted me saying, like, we have this student and they're exhibiting some type of like violent tendencies or aggressive, or they wrote something in a paper and we're not entirely sure, how serious we should take this, or how, what appropriate steps we should take. And we do what's called a risk assessment. Now, there's no such thing as a student that has zero risk, but you look at small, moderate, high risk, but you look at it from a number of variables. We look at a lot of these things that are called protective and pro-social variables. The more somebody has these in their life, the more oftentimes the outcome, they have healthy responsibilities, they do well in life, they have minimal to no, legal problems or other things like that. These are the things we want to focus on. Grades is not a predictor of a healthy, happy life. There's just not. In the same way, guess what? Adults, like making a lot of money with your job is not a predictor of a healthy, happy life. We all know this, right? And yet we all get narrow and consumed in moments like that's the most important thing. So let's look at really what truly are strong predictors of a healthy, a meaningful life, especially when we can't avoid adversity or negative emotions. We already talked about the first one, but again, I am very much a broken record. What's the first thing we want in a resilient mindset, the ability to bounce back from adversity? We need radical acceptance. Again, acceptance, make peace with how things are versus how you want them to be. This was the first line of defense where we were able to identify who's going to struggle with the pandemic. Who's having difficulty accepting, like, this is what's happening. How do we adapt? Versus we're still stuck with this is the way things are supposed to be. This is the way things have always been. The more you move into a state of acceptance, you're not fighting something you've already lost. It's not there. So you can move on to these other key components. And I always talk about two sides to this. The starting point of healthy living is a coin with two sides. This is the first side. This is heads. Radical acceptance, the ability to make peace with how things are versus how we want them to be. I would have loved to have been 6'4". I know so many people that have height and they're horrible at basketball. And I'm like, dude, if I had had that, I would probably have been the second or third Asian to play in the NBA. But I accept how things are versus how I want them to be. How much of our conflict and internal conflict is we're still not accepting what is reality? And the more we get stuck there, we can't move on to a lot of these other things. So that's the first side of the coin of resiliency. The second side of the coin is adaptability and mental flexibility. Okay, this is the way things really are. It's not the way I wanted them. It's not the way I envisioned or planned or prepared, but it is. Okay, so now how do I need to regroup? That really was the second most critical component when we looked early on in the pandemic. Who's gonna maybe survive and thrive and who's really gonna struggle? We just went through 2 years of just constant adapting, right? And we know a lot of folks that struggle with anxiety hate Change. Well, we just went through 2 years where we did a lot of changing. And we know folks with anxiety hate the unknown. Well, we just came out of a period like we had no idea when these things were going to change and what's going to be the implication. It's no wonder, especially in these last 2 years, we've seen a surge of anxiety. Difficulty changing, difficulty with the unknown. That was the pandemic. And if we were in this hyper-arousal state, that's why we're seeing people collapse and burn out, because their body was not able to have consistent release, safety, downtime, recover, replenish. Now, some of us say, like, I never really felt that way, but most likely what you started to feel was just a little numb and desensitized. So like our emotions in life didn't really have that normal roller coaster ups and downs. It was just kind of flat line. Nothing really gets me down, but nothing really gets me up either. So radical acceptance, adaptability, and mental flexibility. That's what we call a growth mindset, a flexible mindset. We know that folks with rigid mindsets, when things don't turn out their way, they fall apart. They don't know how to bend and adapt. So we can see that usually with our mindset. So adaptability, mental flexibility is critical for resiliency because we can't avoid disappointment. You are going to fail at something, partly because, especially with radical acceptance, everything we want in life, everything you guys envision and dream of, you don't have full control of whether or not it will happen. And if we're banking a healthy, happy, fulfilling life on getting everything we want, you're not going to have a healthy, happy life because it's not fully in your control. Because here's an interesting thing I always tell folks. If everybody got what they wanted, I have no idea what my marriage would look like. And I have no idea what my family with my daughters would look like if all of us were getting what we want. Because we're individual, different people. We don't always want the same thing. How would that work? Guess what? It doesn't. Now, this next one is really important for men. It's important for all of us. It's just one of those things that, hey guys, guess what? We don't do as well as women. A resilient mindset is having an open mind, openness to help. I'm not good at this. There's something really empowering being able to tackle your problems on your own. But guess what, guys? When we're not tackling our problems successfully, we kind of make a mess a lot longer than we need to. Now, you might be saying, that's not me, and that's fine. I don't want to pigeonhole anybody or stereotype, but the data suggests and shows us that women are much more open to asking for help. It doesn't challenge their femininity or their sense of self in a way that we repeatedly hear men talk about, like asking for help is a sign of weakness. I should be able to do this myself. That's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons why men tend to wait to go to the doctor or the dentist. They don't tend to be as successful with preemptive regular checkups, things along those lines. That's probably why I once ran out of oil in my car and it stalled up in the middle of Providence Road, just not asking for help. That's why I don't go to the dentist as often as my wife begs and nags me to. It's very often guys will wait till you have to. Till there's no way that I can fix it on my own. But a lot of times we've made a mess of that. And I especially see that when it comes to therapy, because women are much more open and have normalized therapy. Guys still struggle with that. So openness to help really exhibits a resilient mindset. Now here's the thing. The older your kids get, the more I encourage you parents to step back and be supportive and be a help, but not be the primary help. Now, it doesn't have to be a therapist, be a youth pastor, it could be a coach, it could be friends' parents, could be an aunt or uncle. But teaching your kids that it's okay to need help. You're gonna make mistakes. And listen to this, it's okay if mom and dad don't know everything, as long as they feel like they can go to somebody if they're struggling or if they need support and help. What do we need to develop a resilient mindset? The next principle is called an internal locus of control, a strong internal locus of control. At its most basic terminology, that means personal responsibility, personal accountability. Now, oftentimes we think about that, though, in a negative way, right? Take responsibility. You're accountable for this. And there's a certain element of that, but locus of control is so much more bigger than that. An internal locus of control, or a locus of control, is how we frame power and influence. And what an internal locus of control really means is nobody has full control, right? We don't control everything. But nobody has more control, power, and influence to determine the quality of your life than you do. Your choices are the most critical factor in the life that you live. And that's an invitation for empowerment. That's an invitation that, you know what, even when things, setbacks, disappointment, things don't go the way that you want, you have the ability to carve out and influence your life direction and your quality of life. And that's really, does that mean personal responsibility? Yes. Is that accountability? Yes, but it's empowerment. It's really designed to empower someone. Those with an external locus of control say, no matter what I do, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I have very little power. So they exaggerate the things they don't have control over and don't have power in, and they globalize it. A person with an external locus of control says, well, it doesn't really matter the choices that I make. I feel like I deserve a good life. Or, yeah, I messed up, but you know what? My parents shouldn't punish or have consequences. You sort of see how you start to warp how much our choices really factor into the quality of our life and our direction. Those with an internal locus of control, they're going to course correct because they recognize, how did I get myself into this situation? And it's not about blame. It's not about fault. It's how did I get here? How do I get out of here? Someone with a resilient mindset, this is really critical, especially with anxiety and depression, because anxiety and depression really distorts our view of ourselves, and it really amplifies our negative self-talk. And what we've learned is that we have greater ability to build off our strengths than you do to pick up your weaknesses and deficits. The myth of being well-rounded and good at everything, it's so unnecessary. I'm horrible in science. So what did I do? I didn't go into science. We don't have to be good at everything. We know that if you build off of strengths and you find those things you're passionate about, you find those things that activate, the more we nurture our strengths, it helps offset those areas where we're not particularly awesome at. Guess what a lot of schools, a lot of teachers, and a lot of parents hyper-focus on, though? Those areas of, average or below average or struggles. The research tells us, man, if we don't neglect them, but if you focus more on those strengths and those interests, you can see a kid thrive. And isn't that what we want? Isn't that what we tell, you get that message find your passion, find your things of that nature. And that can be interests, but also personality traits. I mentioned earlier, grades or job aren't a predictor of a healthy, happy life, but your ability to be yourself and connect with people. And this is really important because we live in a society, and I know I'm kind of part of this too, but we live in a society that generally over-romanticizes extroverts. Extroverts get further in so many areas and are more popular in so many areas than introverts. So a lot of introverts will come to see me, it's I wish I could be like this. I wish I could be like, they already have this inadequacy view of themselves. I'm like, you're quiet. You're more soft-spoken. You like one-on-one environment. You like to read. There's nothing wrong or bad about that. But let's find those things that either you're willing to push yourself and push your personality and temperament, or let's find those areas where you're I belong here. This is my people. And this is my thing. Because, I did student body government, and guess what? I did the loudest, the longest, the funniest speech. It has nothing to do with whether or not I was get the best candidate for student body. I worked in youth ministry. Guess what? They primarily, romanticize, people that are well-spoken. I'm not saying I'm well-spoken. Yes, I am. And so there's just all of these things where we really want to celebrate everybody's personality and uniqueness, even if they think they're awkward. I love weird people. I love weird people. I love quirks. I love those things that make them unique. But at a very young age, and a lot of us even in our adult age, we see that as an insecurity. And oftentimes we assume people are looking down at us or judging us or being critical of that. It's mostly in our own minds. We're projecting. Now, having said that, a resilient mindset, what are those things that help people? Well, we talked about this a little bit with social media and technology. We do need to help young people forge relationships and connection. It can look different. It can be more of a hybrid model than maybe a lot of us adults. A lot of us adults are face-to-face, right? The majority of us are in office work, whereas maybe the kids, a lot of them are, work from home. We want to find that hybrid for them because you do develop a lot of necessary social skills and communication skills through face-to-face. Verbal, nonverbal, tone, eye contact, that can be really compromised or diminished through purely, technological communication and interaction. But we also know this. There's just something you can't quantify with connecting with people when you're in the same space. If you guys were watching me on a screen, I know some of you are, hey, or if you guys were at home, there is still something that's different. And so the other is this, is getting up and going somewhere is a really important factor of priorities, like effort, right? Effort is a key thing in terms of commitment and priorities. When we make things too convenient, we lose the effort that we put in that helps differentiate what's really important and of more priority. I'm not saying convenient things aren't important or priority. I'm saying we need to value face-to-face connection and relationships. And here's one of the ways that a kid's not doing well in school. A kid's arguing with his family. A young person doesn't feel particularly social or doesn't have a lot of friends. Now, we could talk about each one of those things, and oftentimes we do, but there's usually a fourth category I introduce, then they're like, what? I'm like, all the research tells us this is going to be a great protective and pro-social variable that we as a society have downplayed, and they value contributing to society. They get a job, they volunteer. Now, the problem is that we as a society value that, but we went about it in the wrong way. And what I mean by that is this. We kind of said, well, the more you volunteer, it'll look better on your college applications, and that will hopefully help you. And again, if we're helping each other, that's great, but you do lose some of that based upon just the whole idea of helping to help. I mean, our society and culture the last 50 years, we hit an all-time high in rates of narcissism in young people. So anything that we can really generate giving back, having perspective of you're valued, but you're not the most important person in the world. You are important, but everybody else is. And the more we're able to see out of our own neurotic, self-absorbed self, and I'm not calling young people self-absorbed, I'm calling all of us neurotic and self-absorbed, but the more you develop that ability to see outside of your perspective, that's what empathy is. The ability to see things through other people's experiences and perspective. Volunteer work, all the research says, that helps with your overall mental health, well-being, a sense of purpose, a sense of contributing to society, and it helps you for inclusion in other areas of like being around people you would maybe not otherwise interact and socialize with. I'm a big believer in students having part-time jobs. Big believer. I'm a big believer in part-time work while you're in college. because that sense of responsibility, and unlike school, you get paid. Like you immediately get something, whereas a lot of school is what we call long-term benefits, immediate consequences. It's like, hey, I got a good grade, so I can take this other class. And hey, I got a good grade, so I can take this even higher class. Versus you get a job, you interact with people, you learn respect, listening, hard work, and you get paid for it. I think that's a great gig, right? Be a good person and get paid for it? Sign me up. And here's one that is really, I think, big that we've lost in the age of instant gratification, the age of convenience, the age of overparenting, where a lot of parents have done a lot for their kids, or where even the schools themselves are doing a lot for kids, is that we need to develop a commitment to self-management. Well, what is self-management? Self-control, self-discipline. The more other institutions are doing that for you, it's not self. It's your parents. It's the school. A lot of my young guys that struggle in that transition to college, they went to a school where it was great, it was very supportive, but the teachers were reaching out to the kid. The teachers were reaching out to the parents. The teachers were giving them all opportunities to make up missed work and missed assignments. And guess what? You go to college and, no, that don't happen. But they lack that self-management. They're used to someone else doing that, right? That external locus of control. My choices, the way I shape my life and decisions I make has the greatest ability. Part of the over-parenting, the over-functioning is parents have been over-rescuing. A lot of kids haven't experienced the natural consequences of their choices. And that's a really healthy thing, because it's healthy to experience consequences, feel the discomfort, but also realize it's not the end of the world. It doesn't make my parents a bad parent. It doesn't make me a bad kid. It's life. The more we shield and protect them of that, the more we are losing resiliency. And then finally, a resilient mindset views mistakes as opportunity to learn and grow, rather than you've ruined your life. Or as parents, we can personalize. How could you do that to me? Or as a parent, like, great, well, now I can't put your grades up on Facebook because they're not that great. So I can't get the Parent of the Year award on social media. I'm a big believer in mistakes. I'm a big believer in imperfection. If I wasn't, I don't know how I would live with myself. So much of what shaped me is not just mistakes, but adversity, setbacks, even things that were out of my control. My parents divorcing shaped me who I am, required me to work. And I know a lot of times when people don't have to work as a teenager or young person, they opt not to. But there's something really valuable of working and learning how to communicate with as consumers, as adults, managing schedule. Even though people feel busier, we are actually not busier. About a couple years ago, they looked at research about the amount of homework that young people were given, and it hasn't really fluctuated or changed that much, but our perception of time has been warped. And part of that is also like we're more easily distracted, we're more multitasking, jumping from thing to thing, thought to thought. It's taking us longer to complete things, but it's not actually a whole lot more. And so that's usually the argument against work. But a lot of times, if too much free time doesn't make us more efficient, it actually makes us less productive and less efficient. I'm a big believer in stretching, right? That leap of faith. Let's see how this will help you. Let's see if you can handle this. And if you can't, it's not the end of the world. Living not based on fear. Because if it doesn't work out or you make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. It's not. But that's really what that anxious, hyper, vigilant state tells us. And then when we look on social media online and everyone else is just rocking it, we're like, why am I having all these problems? It's like, let's step back, take a deep breath. You're okay, I'm okay, it's gonna be okay. I think most of us fundamentally believe that in many ways. But on any given day, it's really hard to live that way, right? It's hard to live that way. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a couple minutes and we're going to shift to a discussion time. And throughout this time, you're welcome to continue to write questions down. And part of the writing, and I know people are here, is that so I can just read it out loud so folks that are online, if they're watching this, they can hear the question clearly, things of that nature. I would encourage you, at least at the beginning, to try to keep some of your questions somewhat related to what we've talked about. If there's a question that really veers far off, maybe after we wrap up, if you're willing to stay a little longer, we can kind of talk about that to the side. So if you have any questions, I believe Kent's walking around. You're also welcome to write them here. I already have one because I wanted to kick things off. So I appreciate the person that handed this to me on a break. And the question's really about anxiety. And they're wanting to know, is heredity a factor in anxiety? And how much is environment, the environment you were raised in, affect adult anxiety? Well, we know it's both. It's not an either or. It's not environmental. It's not genetics. It's both. I think the research kind of points to, like, by a slight majority, genetics wins out in so many other ways. But environment is a huge, significant, critical factor as well. Now, here's one of the things I was telling this person during the break, what we've learned in the last 20 years, that's especially prevalent to anxiety. That anxiety is quickly amplified when you have multiple family members under the same roof with anxiety. Because they tend to be sponges that absorb the other person's anxiety, and it agitates and antagonizes their own, and they tend to react. So you can see when there's two or more family members under the same roof with anxiety, things can go from 0 to 60 like that. And a lot of times it can also be partly, impacted by their anxiety style. One common style of anxiety, when they get anxious, they want to resolve everything, and they tend to overtalk and talk in circles and repeat themselves. Other people, when they get anxious, they want to do the flight mode. I want to detach. Well, what do you do if a child wants to detach and the parent wants to keep talking? Or vice versa. I once had a client whose mom would lock herself in her closet door because when she would say no, he would not relent for hours. And so it's not just anxiety, genetic, the environment, but we do know there's a genetic component. We know that about all mental health. Oftentimes, that's one of the key factors in getting individual and family therapy, is recognizing, what's our response to anxiety, because things can quickly amplify. And if we can recognize that, the person that wants to keep talking realize all you're doing is antagonizing them. You're actually making it harder to have a productive conversation. You're actually delaying any form of resolution. And that's hard, but it's easier, I'm not saying easy, it's easier for the person pursuing to pause than is the person that's withdrawing to lean into the discomfort. So great question. Kent, you have a couple more? Thank you very much. And again, you're welcome to keep writing these down. Oh, boy, I love how everyone has great penmanship. That's a lost art form. And no, my eyesight's great. I'm just stretching my arm as I read this. What are you talking about? Is it normal for anxiety to manifest as anger? If so, how do you suggest I manage that? How can I help someone else to come out of that anger? Great question. Yes, anger is one of the key features of anxiety because it's all about tension and agitation, right? We're sensitive to some form of stimuli. That's really what a lot of our mental health challenges are, is there's an external catalyst of a stimuli or stressor that we have a strong reaction to. And so for anxiety, irritability, anger, absolutely. But a lot of times it can also come from how their anxiety manifests. Anxiety can like control. If you don't have control, they can get really frustrated and agitated and angry. But it comes from that fixed, rigid mindset we talked about when we were going through, resiliency versus mental flexibility. Having to have the last word. You can't have the last word. Guess what? You get, even though that's a control issue. I don't have to have the last word. I just generally get it because it's like the best word. So, but I don't have to have it. So, But it is about irritability. Now, one of the interesting things is when we work with anxiety, it's like, how do we build in stress relievers? Because that lifestyle we talked about, chronic stress or anxiety, it builds up. How do we have a valve where we lower the buildup of anxiety? Because if there's so many things in our life that we can't fully control, but we're anxious and stressed about, it means you're always refueling and replenishing the anxiety you carry around. It's what we oftentimes kind of like a chronic or perpetual trigger. So the key then is, what are your stress relievers? Because if you don't have a stress reliever, you fill up, you fill up, you fill up, you fill up. How many times have you unloaded on someone and that was just the straw that broke the camel's back, that really wasn't like the thing that truly, warranted such a Mount Vesuvius sort of response? How do you manage that? Obviously, the most effective holistic remedy for mental health, mental illness is exercise. We always look at the four corners of healthy living: sleep, diet, exercise, and social interaction. Anxiety oftentimes will be antagonized by a stimulant. So even though you might think caffeine or nicotine is helping, it's probably also leading to a crash later on that you can be even that much more agitated. Coping skills that have movement and mobility, and the more your coping outlets, whether it's an individual outlet or a series of coping skills, tap into your five senses. The more that you tap into your five senses, the more you're sending signals to your body and brain like you're in a place of safety. You can calm down. You're safe, you can calm down. The other thing that I have a client I work with, and his anxiety is high, and he has these very strong reactions towards his wife. And so what we did is we gave him a strategy where when you're upset with your wife, you write her a letter, and then you wait 24 to 48 hours. And after 24 or 48 hours, when things have calmed down, if you still feel like there's valid things you're still upset about, but you're not at that peak emotional state, then we find a way to communicate and talk about it. But we get out that emotion, we get out those feelings. Those letters are not always pretty, they're not love poems, but it's giving you a place to discharge or externalize. But again, I talked about earlier, writing is a great way to slow down the brain, organize your thoughts. When we get anxious, when we get anger, our thoughts and our heart rate and our minds speed up. So writing would be another effective way of calming yourself down. And again, revisit it. Later on, if you feel like there really was a valid grievance or something that needs to be addressed, now you have the opportunity in a more calm and composed way, and maybe even write some more. How do I confront? How do I address it? Now, how do you help someone else come out of that anger? That's a great question. That's the difficult. Now, on the one hand, I do believe this not to be 100% true, but I do believe this to be significantly true. You can't help somebody who doesn't want to help. Right? If they don't think they have an anger problem, if they think you're demanding or you're annoying or why can't you change, then you're going to have a very low ceiling. This is a very unsatisfying way of living, but I'm going to give you a strategy that is very appropriate and a very effective in certain facets of life. It's this strategy. Sometimes you can't make things better, but you can always make things what? Worse. Now, I told you that's not a long-term strategy, and we're not trying to deflect responsibility, right? I'm a big believer in internal locus of control, but that oftentimes helps you not take the bait. And we need to own our own actions. We're not to blame. We may not be the catalyst, but it takes two people to tango. You can step out of the dance hall. Does that solve the problem? No, it removes you from that problem in that moment. And then most likely, if this is a problem that's really impacting the relationship or the household, I would encourage you to seek additional help and support. Because a lot of times people with anger problems, if they aren't aware of it, if they're not willing to admit it, you kind of need the third party outside people to help you. Otherwise, we just try to break through that more and more, get them to believe it, get them to see it, and all you're doing is antagonizing them more. And that's a vicious cycle that you find yourself in. Another question about anxiety. Can you share a bit about the connection between anxiety and depression? Yes. Well, first of all, you wrote it in alphabetical order, so that's great. Anxiety, then depression. I think one of the connections is we know that either one of those, if it's not being managed, tends to have a vicious cycle where it leads to the other one. Now, here is a very oversimplified way that we oftentimes define or explore depression and anxiety. Anxiety is about the unknown and feeling helpless. Depression usually is about the past and feeling hopeless. Hopelessness and helplessness. Now, we know from a chemical standpoint it's very different, but a lot of times it's fundamentally about our brain is in a position where it's hypersensitive to a particular stimuli. For anxiety, it's stress. It's the unknown. It's fear. For depression, it's sadness. It's hopelessness. It's discouragement. Now, all of us feel sad and discouraged, maybe depressed too. All of us feel stressed, feel anxious, worried, and afraid. Again, we go back. It's that exaggerated or irrational level. We always look for irrational statements. Irrational statements, a lot of times if somebody says, oh, that's just a figure of speech, it's like, okay, we can kind of then keep moving on. But if somebody says, like, I know that's not true, but that's how I feel. I know that's not true, but it's true to me. Feelings of hopelessness, feelings of helplessness. Both are really difficult to treat. They both are. The challenge between treating anxiety and treating depression is this: oversimplification. Anxiety, oftentimes, they still have the ability to do things. They're just maybe not doing the things that are going to help decrease the anxiety. Depression makes doing anything harder. Partly because there's no belief it's actually going to help. It's really hard to do something if you believe it's going to make no difference. It's harder because there's a physical weight. There's a very physical component, whereas we know, like, stress hormones and cortisol with anxiety, it activates us, right? Now, obviously, there's different levels, OCD or, panic attacks, but depression is really difficult because a lot of the things that are going to help them require them to do. Get them out of their head, get them out of their room, get them out of their sedentary, isolated environment. If it was that easy, they'd be doing it. Here's the other biggest challenge for depression. And I don't know how much people truly believe this, or in a moment of just loss of composure, it's what they say. But I hear people really question and doubt depression in others an awful lot. Because here's the thing. I know I can be lazy. Here's the thing. I know I am lazy in certain times and moments. But that doesn't mean I'm lazy all the time. And when someone struggles with depression, it's just like they're not lazy, they're just lazy or they're unmotivated. It's like, well, we know people can be that way and we know people are that way, but man, how must that land when you're depressed and the people you go to for support or non-judgmental regard, and they say, you're just being lazy, or you're just so sensitive, right? That's what we often hear. You're so sensitive. Or we oversimplify and make it very trite. Just do this. I always say, if it was that easy, they'd be doing it. If it was that easy, they'd be doing it. Anxiety and depression, oftentimes, and the other thing is what antagonizes anxiety and depression. It's really helpful to understand some of the choices we make in daily life that can antagonize them both. The number one thing to antagonize depression and anxiety is sleep. But the second for depression is alcohol. Alcohol is a depressant. Guess what? Alcohol also disrupts your sleep. So if the two most impactful things to depression is in your life, like you may feel better or not depressed for a moment, but most likely you're going to pay for it later on. Man, you guys are good. We're good, man. We're going to get out of here. You got some more questions? You're going to get out of here soon. Trust me that. Last round. All right, we're going to do these questions, then we're going to wrap up, and then I will hang around if other people have more questions or just want to ask something more in a semi-private. All right, we're going to, again, I'm just stretching my arms, that's all. Does medicine cover mental health? Does Medicaid cover mental health? It can. I tend to encourage folks to explore all different means for mental health. Obviously, your insurance, obviously Medicaid, but someplace like this church or a lot of faith communities, as well as NAMI, is free resources and tools either in the community or also a lot of communities of faith have a part of their budget or even benevolence for mental health situations. Not all do, and sometimes you have to have a relationship with the church and the house of faith itself. But I don't work with Medicaid, I don't work with insurances, but most folks like me that work in this field, we always have a degree of people we see on a reduced or sliding scale or pro bono or help find resources for that. And that's just part of our ethical obligation is if somebody reaches out to us, we have an obligation to help point you in the direction even if we're not the right person. I think the key, I wish mental health services were more universal. I wish there was more accessibility. I know that's not the case. But a lot of times, because of the great demand, it places the onus on the consumer to find that in that regard. And that's one of the challenges, even if you have insurance or Medicaid, is like so much of it you're still being asked to do. If you're in that situation, one of those resilient principles, ask for help. Ask for a family member or someone even in the church. Can you help me figure some of this out? I need some help. I need some resources and services, but it can be daunting. It can be overwhelming because it is, for sure. How does a family member help to reduce the anxiety in another family member? Great question. Already that starting point that I mentioned, which was you can't always make things better. We can always make things worse, right? Here's one of the biggest challenges, but if we can do this, you will see the anxiety in a family member decrease. It's finding ways to self-soothe and de-escalate. Now, even when you're trying to help, if you're talking, that may be a stimuli. That stimuli may be adding to the anxiety. Your presence, if they want to be left alone, that may be adding stimuli. Part of this is how you help is what would they find helpful? Because anxiety presents itself in unique, different ways, and what helps de-escalate and re-regulate the person is different every way. When we want to help, some of our first natural instinct is help means be a part of it. Talk them through that, be present. Sometimes that's not helping. Right? You ever met somebody who just wants to be left alone? Now, there's a difference between giving space to de-escalate and then ignoring, right? Walking on eggshells and just letting things calm down and never address them. But it's all about timing. Now, again, if that's really difficult for you, maybe you struggle with anxiety too, right? That unresolved, and we like things resolved, and so we oftentimes have to check our own emotional responses to other people's negative emotions. I get more, this might be ironic, but as a mental health professional, I can be really empathetic and non-judgmental with my clients, and I have to work harder at that with my family. It's because they don't pay me. It's honest. They cost me. They don't pay me. No, but that's one of the challenges is that family makes things different. It just does. But that's what makes it so special. But that's what makes it so difficult. But again, it's a different way to think. It's what we tend to call containment or harm reduction. We can't always make things better. Sometimes we can just help things move out of being bad by stepping back, be supportive, be available, but not really be involved if they don't want it. Now, obviously, if they say, you could get me a glass of water, I don't want to be alone, can you hug me, can you talk to me? Well then, if they're telling you that, follow suit. But if they don't know, then a lot of times it's this conversation. Well, do you think this might? Do you think this might? Now, here's the key, though. You can do a little bit of that when they're anxious, but you might find out pretty quickly, like, oh, yeah, this type of conversation is not helping. That's really when you may need to circle back around at another time. And this is actually pretty prevalent with anxiety and panic attacks. It's kind of like a riptide. That the more you try to fight it, the longer and the more exhausting it can be. Once somebody's in a panic attack, we just kind of have to help them ride it through. Because there's sometimes when we're at an emotional place through the chemicals that are saturating our brain, it's kind of like a clogged sink. You kind of just have to let the stress hormones drain before you're ever going to get to the place where even the things you're offering, they have any capability and functioning to take in or even to act on. Okay, so this is the first one I'm going to have to really work on here. Okay, because how long will it take for a person to resolve the anxiety issue where this person is married to a person who is controlling and manipulative and will sometimes be aggressive? Well, in a lot of ways, if somebody's exhibiting, again, anger, control, manipulation, if they don't acknowledge it, if they don't see that as a problem, if there isn't really any sign of commitment to change and recognition that's inappropriate, you're likely going to have to remove yourself from that environment before things can change, if they can change at all. Like, anytime there's physical safety or any type of physical abuse or aggression, it's like that person, a lot of times, once they lose control, you can't reason with them. And at the same time, we don't know what all the triggers and cues are. So, and then it can be compounded or amplified if there's A, alcohol involved, or B, they point to you as the trigger or the catalyst. If they view you as the trigger or catalyst, I'm not saying you are, but if they view you that way, you trying to help them, you're already, that's a lost cause. That's a setup for things. It's really, even overall, especially in a house of faith, we really hold the sanctity of marriage. But oftentimes when things are broken down to a physical component, physical safety and the ability to not have this continue is the most important starting point. The safety needs to be there, and then only truly can you start to unpack whether or not the other person has whatever level of degree of accountability, remorse, willingness to change, and putting in parameters that are necessary for that to happen. Because essentially, if somebody shows a level of aggression or abuse, it's about control. It's about control. And it's oftentimes in the fabric of their DNA. As long as you're still in their path, they will have difficulty not trying to control you through intimidation and verbal or physical or emotional levels of aggression, intimidation, or abuse. And again, I really value and appreciate the depth and the honesty of these questions. And I'm just really trying to be real with you all. Life is messy, relationships is messy, mental health, mental illness, our own or others, it's messy. If it was uncomplicated, I'd see someone 2 or 3 times and life would move on. And I'd have to have a part-time gig as like a bouncer, right? Yeah. But it's messy. It's complicated. And sometimes no matter how much we want, sometimes no matter how much we work, we don't fully control the situation because other people have agency and free will as well. But just in the same way that you showed up here today, just in the same way you wrote this down to have a conversation, I really encourage folks, if they're struggling, to seek out help and support. It doesn't always have to be a mental health professional, but going at these things alone makes it harder. And oftentimes, if we're asking for help, it means we've probably exhausted our own resources and trying to figure out what to do and how to crack the code. And I say this a lot to my clients when they're being really hard on themselves or they place a lot of responsibility of other people on them, is I oftentimes say this. I want you to think about, right, look at all those like disclaimers. I want you to think about giving yourself permission to let go of taking responsibility for that person's actions. And for those that are watching or for those that are here, it takes a lot of nuance in a community of faith because we're meant to love and to support. But you also are in the image of God, and we are all given inherent right of dignity and safety. And we can't be imprisoned by our ideals to the point where it's hurting us. And so reach out for help. Don't go at it alone. And, mental health and relationships, it's tough. When it's going well, it's some of the most beautiful, enthralling things in life. And when we see people suffering, it's so painful to witness that or to experience that. So thank you all very much for your very thoughtful questions. I don't know if someone's going to close us up, an MC, a bouncer, the relief pitcher. But for those of you online, I appreciate your time. And for those of you that took the time to come in and be a part of this and share with one another, I really appreciate your guys' your fellowship in your community as well. So,
Thank you, Jonathan, so much for being here. I think you said you're willing to stick around if people have some questions. Perhaps they didn't feel comfortable writing on a piece of paper, or something's come to mind since he took the last question. I just want to thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us online. This is part of a larger effort at our church family to be very aware of and put resources into people's hands with regard to mental health. As I mentioned, we had a series last year in October that lasted for a couple of months, and since then we've had an entire mental health ministry be created with folks on our mental health team, and we have ongoing classes on Sunday mornings. Every time we have class offerings, we have a class that's been focused on some level of mental health or some area of mental health, and that is ongoing as well. So I just want to encourage you, if you'd like to learn more, we'd love to connect with you about that and put resources into your hands. Don't forget about NAMI out in the lobby. If you've got any questions about that, the butlers would be happy to answer any questions that you might have. But again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Jonathan, for all the wisdom that you shared with us, and what a blessing it's been today. Let me just say a prayer for us, and if you need to go, feel free, but if you'd like to stick around and visit, you're welcome to do that as well. Father, thank you for today. Thank you for the insights that have been shared and for the courage, as Jonathan mentioned, to ask questions and to show up and to process some of these things. We thank you for gifting Jonathan with wisdom and experience to speak words of hope and insight into our lives, and we just pray that we would become a people that are less anxious and that know how to have the right relationship with technology, and that you would foster within us resilience as well. Thank you for Jesus, and we pray all this in his name. Amen.